I have about 25 years experience in mechanical engineering, manufacturing, and stress analysis for helicopters and airplanes. I'm going to speak a little bit from experience from that aspect and also from just my basic experience with chainsaws themselves. This saw says Pro right on the side, so you know you have nothing to fear. You know you're getting a top quality product with this. Also, as long as we're talking quality, you could probably do well with a pair of these. American made, Camel City Mill wool socks. They'll probably last longer than this particular chainsaw. Truth be told, we've abused the heck out of them. They're lasting great. Okay, I have a little show and tell today. A Poulan Pro chainsaw that was given to my 20-year-old son by one of his clients, his yard mowing clients. After a bit of experience with chainsaws, and after a good bit of research on chainsaws, I created a list of good quality Pro chainsaws that have stood the test of time. That's available in a separate video. In this video, I'm going to talk about purchasing a saw and how saws kind of all look the same. If you see them in the store, see them in a yard sale, see them on Facebook or Craigslist or something for sale, how do you know what you're getting? How do you know the features you're looking for? There's a lot of plastic that covers up the saw. How do you know what's underneath? What features are you looking for? What features tend to produce good quality? Which features perform? Which features are gimmicks? Which features last and which don't? Which are worth paying a little bit of money for? I always advise buying used Pro saws in good condition. That's the best case scenario, I think, for a chainsaw. A well-made chainsaw purchased in good condition can save probably half the money that you would pay for a new one. However, for most users, that saw will last a lifetime. A saw like this, I think, though it serves a purpose, I think disappoints a lot of people. I'm going to go through a couple of features on this saw. I'm going to tear it apart. I've never really looked closely at these saws before. I can see right away it has some good features that a person would look for. But I also see some downsides, some weaknesses in this saw. I'll show you those, and I'll show you what to look for and why these features matter and why you should consider an older, higher quality saw. Let's get started. One feature to note right away is that this cover for the clutch and the chain and sprocket is plastic. That in itself isn't a deal killer, but it is something to look for. The higher quality saws that I've seen before, this cover is metal. Okay, for comparison, I'm showing a clutch cover off of a more high-end chainsaw. This is cast magnesium, and there's a debate whether these are very durable or not. They may not take impact all that great, but I think they are better than the plastic. They also contain a nice feature that also isn't absolutely necessary, but it's nice. They have captive nuts, so when you take the cover off, you don't lose the nuts. These nuts are separate. Now, a lot of older saws that I have, the nuts are separate, and like I say, it's not a deal killer, but it is a nice feature. Another thing to note on this saw is that the chain tensioner is on the side, which I like in general. That's convenient, but it's also built into the clutch cover. This other saw has a clutch cover only. It does not have the tensioner built into the clutch cover. The tensioner for the bar and chain is located inside the body of the saw on the higher quality saws that I'm familiar with. Now I need to clean this up to see how it's put on there. Hold on a minute. I can tell that there are Torx head screws that secure this to this. This is plastic. The Torx head screws secure it to plastic bosses on the plastic bar, the plastic clutch cover. Now, when this screw is turned, you know, it applies force to this little tab here, which engages the adjuster hole on the bar to help, you know, to tension the chain. Now, there can be a bit of force that goes through here in order to tension the chain. Then you tighten the bar nuts. There is some metal in here to take up the compression, which is good. So, I don't know. I just question whether this is strong enough to last long term. It does have a separate part number where it looks like maybe you can take it off and replace it. But I also question availability of those parts. I haven't really looked it up, so I guess I could try that and see. Also down here is a little plastic bumper for the chain, and it's got some wear on it, but that's not replaceable. If that wears out, that part's not replaceable. If that wears out, it appears you have to replace the entire clutch cover. On a more professional grade saw that's made for long life and service, these parts are replaceable. They're separate from the metal. They're plastic little parts that are replaceable. Same for the little chip catcher in the back. Now, I know this is of questionable quality here too, compared to, for instance, the West Coast saw billet cover, but still, it's replaceable. It comes on and off. So, in general, there's a theme here for a pro saw versus there's a general theme here. Does the saw contain replaceable parts that appear that are intended to be serviced, or is it kind of a big one-piece assembly that's easy to injection mold in a big machine and put on the saw and sell at the store, but when it wears out, what's it designed for? In my opinion, this is designed for the trash can when it wears out, and it's designed for you to purchase another one. I think pro saws have a better philosophy there of replacement of wear items. Okay, let's get into the sprocket here. This is a spur sprocket that's on this clutch drum. There's a small clip ring, C-clip, that you have to take off to get to it. Let me do that and then I'll show it to you. There's a bit of a surprise here. Here's the sprocket that turns the chain, but this sprocket is completely split. It's just worn so much that big chunks of it came off. Let me get you a closer look at that. Okay, I'm getting you in pretty close on this one. You can see as I turn this clutch drum that right here is an example of wear. On a spur sprocket like this, the chain tends to wear a small little notch or a groove in the sprocket. This is an extreme case where that groove got so deep and the person didn't maintain or replace their sprocket so much that it eventually just blew apart. Another thing to point out with this setup is that this is one piece, the sprocket and the clutch drum. Now we'll take a look at a saw that I think has a little bit better implementation of these features than the other saw. You'll see that it does have an adjuster out here for the chain tensioner, but this is only an access hole through to the tensioner, which is part of the saw itself. The clutch cover itself is plastic. By the way, this is a 42cc saw, just like the other Poulan Pro is also 42 cc's. Similar size saw. Okay, you take off the clutch cover. It's plastic. It has some metal washers for the compression as you tighten the nuts. But the cover itself is not doing double duty for anything. All it's doing is handling chips and keeping your arms out of the chain. So, you know, that's a little different setup. Where the business is going on with the chain, there's actually some metal here to protect the saw. The other saw is all plastic. In this area, this is all plastic. It's part of the saw. There's no protective plate here. There's a feature here I'll show you that which I really like, which is a rim sprocket. As on the other saw, you know, it has the clutch drum that drives the sprocket, but it's a little different setup. It has this little drive gear that floats back and forth, so that allows the sprocket to always completely line up with the bar groove, so there's less friction there and less wear on the sprocket. The chain rides on this sprocket like that, which runs smoother because it's totally round and it supports the chain. It also floats back and forth. And also the added benefit is when that sprocket wears out, you take the circlip off, you throw away the little little sprocket, and you put a new one on. You don't have to replace the clutch drum because they don't wear out as quickly as the sprocket typically. So again, this is set up more for continual use and replacement of parts as they wear out. It's not made to throw stuff away that you don't need to throw away. Okay, one big feature to notice about saws too is the setup of the crankcase. You know, there's a piston in here that goes up and down. It runs on a crank. One side of the crank comes out on the chain side, and one side of the crank comes out on the pull cord side. If you look at the bottom of this saw, this is cast magnesium. This is cast magnesium. This is cast magnesium. These case halves bolt together. They separate at this line in the center and come apart. There are bearings in this half, bearings in this half for the crankshaft. Traditionally, that's a better, more rigid, durable setup than this more recent design. This saw, I haven't torn totally into it yet, but I think I know, and I think I can tell, this is what's called a clamshell saw. This is plastic handle, plastic. Yet you see the crank coming out here, and the other side of the crank, of course, is under the pull cord. Well, there are bearings at each end of this crank for that piston. If all this is plastic, how are those bearings supported? Are they supported in plastic, or is there metal? We'll see as we tear it apart. I think we're going to find a small, minimal amount of metal in there for the crank bearings. Let's see what we find as we tear it apart. I happen to know that the previous owner had trouble with the oiler on this saw. So as we tear into it, we'll try to see what's going on with this oil passage right here. See if there's any reason the oil isn't coming out. Sadly, these days, one thing I've looked for in equipment is right here. I don't know if you can see that, but that I think tends to affect the overall quality of the product in general. Now, let's see if we can get to under this clutch. Big washer. Plastic. Okay, in tearing apart this saw, I took off the flywheel. So there are a couple differences here you'll see. One thing is that on most flywheels, almost all flywheels, I mean cranks actually, there's a notch. And that notch is there to align the flywheel with the crank because there are magnets that control ignition. So you have to keep that lined up. Well, I don't know if you can see here. I'll try to get the camera focused well. Right here is a built-in keyway that fits the crank. This is cast into the cast into the flywheel. A lot of saws have a different setup, which I think is better, where they have a smooth hole in the flywheel. They have the notch in the crank, and then a separate steel key that holds the flywheel to the crank. I think that's a better setup. These that are cast in, I think is just a cheaper setup, and if that ever gets damaged, then you have to throw away the entire flywheel and start over. I don't like that setup. Okay, here's what's referred to as the clamshell saw. You've got a horizontal mating surface here between the parts. This upper part, the cylinder, drops down on top of this bottom section. This creates essentially the crankcase that you have in other saws. This is cheaper to manufacture, requires less metal, and you'll see underneath it joins to the plastic with 4 screws. Now this works, it's effective, but some people don't like it because they like to modify their saws. One particular downside of this I'll show you has to do with modifying saws. I don't really know the downsides, many of the other downsides, other than maybe it's a little bit less rigid alignment of these bearings with the crank. One downside is if you want to modify the saw by trimming away part of the bottom of this cylinder so that you can drop it closer to the saw and get the piston to come up closer to top dead center and make more compression. You can't do that with this setup, because if you mill off part of this bottom section here and try to put it back together, it won't fit right with this bearing. So you've got a fixed arrangement here that you can't modify. That's one reason people don't like it in particular. As far as longevity and durability, frankly, I really don't know the difference between this clamshell arrangement and a setup where you have 2 metal case halves that separate in the center. It seems like you've got less case volume with this, which may affect tuning and lubrication of the bearings. I'm not sure, but other people might be able to chime in with that. But I know some people have had some pretty good luck with clamshell saws, but I'm just showing you this is a cheaper way to manufacture it, cheaper and easier, and so that's one of the reasons the saws are cheaper. Okay, I've taken the case apart. Here's the bottom end. This is the crank here. You can see this lower crank half doesn't leave much volume in there at all. So I think volume in the crankcase is desirable for good performance. I'm not an engine builder, but I think volume inside here can affect the flow of air and fuel into the engine. I think it's desirable to have a little more volume down here in the bottom end for performance. Some of you engine builders can maybe chime in. Okay, as you can see, as you look into the bottom of the cylinder, okay, let me show you this aspect of the saw here that kind of surprised me. I've taken this apart. This is the cylinder, this is the top end, and the bottom end. As you look up into this cylinder, you have ports on the side where the fuel and air come in and go up on top of the cylinder in a 2-stroke. Well, surprisingly, this saw has plastic sleeves inside that create the shape of these ports, and the piston rides directly on these. The piston goes in here, it rides directly on those plastic pieces. Now that makes it cheaper to manufacture, but I'm not sure for long-term longevity that having plastic inside the engine is a good way to go. So there, to me, seems to be a major issue with this saw. And part of the reason it's cheap, because it's cheap to manufacture. They've cut corners here. instead of machining these features into the head, which the Pro Saws have, features that the Pro Saws have, they don't have plastic in there. This saw has plastic. So I think that's a terrible problem, and that alone I think would keep me away from this kind of saw. I mentioned earlier that the previous owner had trouble with the oiler on this saw. And I think I know what I'm going to find when I get in there. I think I'm probably going to find a lot of plastic. If I pull this off to find the oil pump, yep, sure enough, plastic gears that ride against the crank. See, here's the crank. It has a little screw thread on it, which is metal. It rides on the oil pump. Rides on these gears on the oil pump and turns the pump. Well, long term, I don't think plastic is really good for long-term performance. There is a little bit of metal in here, but the Pro Saws that I've torn apart, these gears are metal. And metal with oil, I think, lasts longer than in the hot cold cycles that you get with a saw, any kind of engine. Thermal cycling of plastic generally isn't a good thing. So I don't see evidence that this failed necessarily. It is a little dirty, but that's just another way that they cut corners to make a cheap saw that will run for a while and do what most people need. But for long term, I don't trust it. Of course, there are trade-offs with manufacturing. If a saw is cheaper to make, cheaper to sell, they'll sell more of them and the company will make profit. For many users, this saw that I'm taking apart is perfectly adequate for occasional use. With good maintenance, a saw like this may last a person a lifetime if they only use it a couple times per year. For them, that's just fine. For me, I use a saw a little bit more often. I want one that's going to last, and I want one that's going to be a little bit more fun to use each time I fire it up.